these two states of Sabah and Sarawak, they were the ones who joined Malaya in 1963 together with Singapore to form the Federation of Malaysia. So when we speak before 1963, you have Malaya, you have Sabah, you have Sarawak, you have Singapore. Then in 63, of this becomes Malaysia. And within the Malaysian state of Sarawak, meaning border by every side, is the tiny but oil and gas rich Sultanate of Brunei, Darussalam, and apparently the whole island of Borneo is named after Brunei. They were the ones who were an empire at some point, dominating most of the island. They control at least the coastal area because and also some parts of the Philippines because the interiors of Borneo, they have been inhabited for probably thousands of years by various Austronesian speaking tribes and groups, and some they came through different periods of migrations, and they form a number of tribal culture, tribal groups, and that are often known as by outsiders as the Dayak tribe, although of course none of them is called the Dayak, but it's a name that is given to them, and they each have of course their own name. And many of these tribes, they had a fondness for head hunting, so they were a bit feared about that, and that kind of stopped people going too much inland, and because they could literally lose their head when they were doing these kind of things. And there are a few skulls of missionaries that are spread around the island because they didn't understood the message immediately and cut off their head. And this practice of head hunting, it continued more or less into the early 20th century, at least in Sarawak, when they eventually signed peace treaty between the different tribes who were head hunting each other. And since 1927, we have never done any war in between themselves, which is not the same for the countries who wanted to sign this treaty, because there have been a number of wars since then. The world's oldest rainforest, or at least of a significant size, are located on Borneo. Some people say that the Daintree forest in Australia is older, probably is, but it's not as big, it's not as important in terms of biodiversity as Borneo. So it's also the fourth largest after the Amazon rainforest, the rainforest in the island of Papua, and the rainforest in the Congo basin. But it's much older than these three other rainforests. Unfortunately, it's a bit endangered in some parts of it because there is excessive logging, there is land clearing for palm oil, for huge plantations, and they suffer frequently from catastrophic forest fires, which are often caused by the palm oil plantations when they have to clean them up and so on, and that can cause a shocking haze that goes all the way to Singapore and Peninsula Malaysia and so on, and it's not really funny when you have these periods of haze coming over the island. Then in the little Sultanate of Brunei, the wealth that they derive from oil and gas, it has allowed them to not be reliant on the income from forestry. So it means that they've protected their forest, and the country anyway is lightly populated, and most of it is still covered in pristine primary rainforest. So it's an ideal country to see the rainforest. There's a lot of abundance of plant and animal life there, and some of them endemic to the island of Borneo. So we, of all these three countries, will be visiting Brunei Darussalam, a place that is dear to my heart because I've spent some very happy and very interesting, from a professional point of view, years in that island. Basically my job was to help the Sultanate develop the tourism industry because they wanted to diversify the economy. It was not always easy because you had a lot of reservation among the most religious, conservative people in the island who viewed all this influx of infidels as something that maybe the country didn't need, but other people were worried about the future of the economy. So that's how the situation was there. And we are going to explore a bit of course, Borneo in general, and then focus more on the Sultanate of Brunei. So the island of Borneo is right in the middle of the equator. It's surrounded by Malaysia, by Indonesia, by the Philippines, by Vietnam, not far from China, not far from Australia, not far from India, not too far from Japan. So it's in an ideal position. It straddles the equator. Most of it doesn't get affected by typhoons because it's below the typhoon belt. So it's in a good position, and we are going to Brunei, which is located something like 4 degrees north of the equator. So it might be maybe a degree or two colder than Singapore. I can't promise that because it can get also very hot. And on the island of Borneo, the island is divided into 3 countries. To the south, you have the 5 provinces that make up Indonesian Kalimantan, and to the north, you have the 2 Malaysian states of Sarawak to the west and Sabah to the northeast. And in between all these, then you have the Sultanate of Brunei, which is basically encased by the state of Sarawak. And tomorrow, then we arrive at the cruise terminal, which is located in the port of Wara. So Wara is about 20-25 minutes by car from the city center. Buses are very rare, taxis are very rare, because it's a rich country, so everybody got car. So they don't really have a need for buses. There are a few, but I mean, it's not like in some other countries where you have a lot. Now you can try hitchhiking, still some people will stop, but it can be a bit of a challenge to find public transportation. And so hopefully most of our passengers will be going on excursion, so they can enjoy this country. Borneo then, at some point, we're looking thousands of years in the past. It was probably one of the, there are some theories, one of the places from which modern humans dispersed around Southeast Asia, because during the last glacial ages and glacial periods, most of it was mainland. So you could basically walk from Ireland to basically Philippines, so maybe with a small swim to arrive there. So this was a land that a geologist named Sundaram is from there also, the jumping point of the out of Africa migrations that then continued on to Australia. So the population that has been found there was from this, I mean, the remains of many thousand years ago of people from there were from this early out of Africa migrations. At the time, there were also some animals, some megafauna that has since become extinct. These giant pangolins, and they were almost the size of a tiger, but they disappeared. We don't know if it's, or they went extinct rather, we don't know if it's because people ate them, or the tigers ate them. The tigers also disappeared, by the way. There are no tigers anymore in Borneo, and the Borneo elephants were actually born. They were probably elephants at the time, but they also went extinct. Then at some point, Borneo became an island, but about 40,000 years ago, it was still probably linked to the mainland, and that's why they have found some of the oldest remains of modern humans in Southeast Asia, in some caves in Malaysian Borneo and in Indonesian Borneo. The Mia caves are the oldest remains of modern humans in the region, and there is apparently a cave in Indonesian Kalimantan where they have found a skeleton, in good, almost complete skeleton, but missing a foot, the left foot. And apparently, according to the scientists who have studied, this foot was surgically amputated, or purposely rather amputated. It was not eaten by a tiger or something like that. It was maybe it was for a child when this happened, and probably some accident or something. They had to amputate the leg, which moves back from thousands of years back to the time of the first surgical amputation. So there were smart people living there, and of course they will. Those were people who are probably related to the people who went on to go to Australia. There are some remnants of these people in the Philippines, in the Malay Peninsula, not so many in Borneo, because Austronesian groups started coming about 5,000-6,000 years ago, and then they basically got overwhelmed and probably absorbed the earlier Australoid population, so it became a place populated mostly by Austronesian tribes that will end up forming different communities, even some different kingdoms along the way. They were vaguely under the influence of the Hindu and then Hindu Buddhist and Hindu Buddhist empires of Sriwijaya and Majapahit. They were trading because it's a good location also in between the China and India trade, until eventually the Kingdom of Brunei was formed. Around the late 14th century, apparently there was a king, a leader called Awang Anak Betata, who with his brother, of course a number of legends about it, so it's not sure how historically correct it is, but according to these legends, him and his brother, they found a place that they liked, and they call it the Bahuna, which means it's new, and that's where the name Brunei apparently would come from, although there are Sanskrit and Chinese records who use a similar name dating before that. But anyway, apparently either this Awang Anak Betata or his successor converted to Islam, and they would start ruling as sultans, and it is nowadays we have the 29th sultan of this lineage, so it's the second longest reigning dynasty in the world, after the one in Japan. They've been around for 29 rulers since records came. And the third ruler apparently was somebody who came from the Arabian Peninsula, and who was again apparently a descendant of Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima. So it's what is called the Sharifian dynasty, and he married with the daughter of the second sultan, and then all the descendants are his descendants. That's why the sultans of Brunei, they claim descent from Prophet Muhammad, because they are what is called a Sharifian dynasty. There are three of those in the world: Morocco, Brunei, and the one that is most largely accepted as being Sharifian, which is the dynasty of the kingdom of Jordan. Anyway, so the sultans continued. The fifth sultan was probably the most famous of the early sultans, Sultan Bolkiah, because around the late 15th, early 16th century, he expanded Brunei into an empire. They would control most of the coastal areas of Borneo, usually the mouths of the rivers, because they didn't go too much inside the jungles, because of the head cutting that was happening in there, and so they traded with the people, and they did piracy and things like that. But basically, they controlled the maritime trade around Borneo and some parts of the Philippines. Even Manila, before the Spanish arrived, was in the hands of sultans who were either from the family and been appointed there by the sultans of Brunei. And so that was the Brunei Empire. And Sultan Bolkiah, he was known as Nakoda Raga, which means the singing admiral. Apparently, he liked to sing when he was going around, and there was, of course, a legend with a beautiful princess, with a love story, and so on, which is told among the legends of Brunei. But there is a tomb that is supposed to be the body of Sultan Bolkiah, the fifth sultan. Also during his reign, and that's the time when a certain Ferdinand Magellan arrived in the region, only to be killed by a Filipino chief called Lapu-Lapu, or at least by his name. And so Magellan himself never made it around the world, but his expedition continued, and apparently after the Philippines they landed in Brunei, and the Italian chronicler of this expedition, called Antonio Pigafetta, he recounted how the court was relatively far, a very important court with elephants, with lots of gold and nice brocades and so on, and they were living on a water village already at the time, with most of the houses on stilts, only a few houses on the on the land. They were Muslims, and apparently, according again to the legend, I haven't read the text to the original, but not many people have. But everybody says that in this description, Antonio Pigafetta described Brunei town, was known at the time of Cotabato, as a Venice of the East. And that's where nowadays, whenever a city has like 3 canals and so on like this, they call it a Venice of the East, because that idea probably originated there. And shortly after, the Spaniards were arriving in the Philippines, and they came from the Mexican coast and so on, and they started conquering the Marianas, Guam, and the Philippines, and they got their eye on Brunei, and they tried to invade Brunei. So it is known as the Castilian War on the Brunei side. And apparently, because they had bigger cannons and more weaponry, but apparently when they were laying siege to Brunei, they fell ill, dysentery or something like that, they made them too weak to fight, so they had to retreat, and that's how Brunei remained as Brunei, as a Muslim country. Had they won, probably it would be a Christian country nowadays. But of course, they attribute this as divine intervention, which even reinforces them in their faith in Islam, because they defeated basically the Christian Spaniards. After that, the empire that had been built by Sultan Bolkiah, it will slowly start disintegrating, because in many of the river mouths where he had conquered, and in the islands of the Philippines, then individual sultans would appear and wanted to become their own sultans. They didn't want to be vassals or part of the Brunei Empire. So many rival sultanates, some of which exist today, but not sovereign sultanates, were created both around the island of Kalimantan and in parts of the Philippines. And then the Dutch started getting interested in these areas, and the Dutch will end up controlling much of the southern part of Borneo. So this island then started attracting the interest of the Western powers, and the Dutch first, but the British also were eyeing the island, and they were all worried about the influence of each other on these parts. And by the 19th century, there was a young adventurer. He was born in India, but he was British, and he liked adventure and so on. He had some money, so he wanted to go and try doing some trade with the Sultanate of Brunei. Because apparently there was antimony and some minerals that were valuable. So he went with his schooner and arrived in an area that nowadays called Kuching, and to see what trade he could do. But he arrived in the middle of a kind of rebellion by the local chieftains against the Sultan in Cotabato, in the main Brunei town. He apparently started taking the temperature of what's going on. He apparently became friend with the representative of the Sultan, who was being attacked by these rebels. They struck a friendship. He had cannons on board of his schooner, so he started shooting to the people who were perceived as the enemies. And then eventually, of course, the story is more complicated than that, but eventually, in reward to his services to the Sultanate of Brunei, he would be named Raja, or Governor of Sarawak, of that area to the west of the possessions that still remained under Brunei. And this gentleman is James Brooke. I don't know if you've heard of James Brooke. Is probably better known in the English-speaking world than in other parts of the world. And he became the first of 3 generations of Rajas. There were a number of Europeans that became kings or rulers. There was a Swedish sailor somewhere in some cannibal island in the Pacific that became a ruler. There was a French guy, I think, in Chile and so on. So there were a few, but the only one who lasted 3 generations, who created a proper state with institutions and so on, was this dynasty that was created by Sir James Brooke. And of course, the British kind of there were a lot of discussions in Parliament what to do with this, because he was a private citizen. He created a kingdom of which he was the ruler without involving the British, let's say, empire at the time. And so one of his main goals was to protect against, to defeat piracy, which was a problem in the region, and also to combat the headhunting, which was another problem. And often the headhunters went with the pirates, so they would attack something. The pirates, who were mostly Malays, would take the loot. The native population, the Dayaks or Iman as they're commonly known, they would take heads to bring back home and part of the loot. So it was a win-win situation for them. They had the fierce headhunters to do piracy, and they could bring back some heads to their houses. So he tried to combat that. So of course, some people didn't like the idea to stop the headhunting. Some people were actually quite happy that there was some exterior force to stop the headhunting, because of course, when you were a young male in this tribe, it was expected that at some age, and when you were grown up, you would go out, explore the world, and bring back a few heads with you. And then the more heads you brought, the better your chances to get a good marriage with a young lady. Yeah? But of course, some people realize that when you go head hunting, you can lose your own head as well. Huh? So, but of course, they could not go because otherwise they would be seen as weaklings. So if an outside intervention helped, that was a good thing. And that's why many people also adopted Christianity, because once they became Christian, they would not go head hunting anymore. So once James Brooke became the Raja, he also got greedy, and he started taking more and more territory, defending against the pirates, defending against the headhunters, and this was encroaching on the Brunei, on what was remaining of the Brunei Empire, and it started shrinking because the Europeans were expanding. The British were extending their influence in the region. They had taken a little island called Labuan as a coaling station. They were keeping an eye on the Brooke family. There were discussions in Parliament in Britain what to do with this Brooke family, because sometimes he repressed severely the piracy and the headhunting. Sometimes he needed the help of the headhunters to go against others. So all these created stories in Parliament. But basically, he will rule until he passed, I think after his death, his nephew, Charles Brooke, will become the second Raja. We start developing, we start expanding the territory to the expense of Brunei, to the point where they will take a piece of land called Limbang, which separated Brunei into two sides. You've seen the map, you've seen there is a western side and eastern side of Brunei, separated by a bit of land. And at some point there was question of trading this bit of land with the western part of Brunei. But luckily for the Bruneians, they didn't accept this trade, because in Limbang it's mostly a place of rice fields, whereas the western side is a place of oil fields. So if they had accepted the deal, they would have good rice production, but not much more. So the third of the Rajas was the son of Charles Brooke, called Viner Brooke, and Viner Brooke with the last Raja of this confederation. Here we see him with the two paramount chiefs of the Iban tribe, and the Iban tribe was the main tribe in Borneo. These two gentlemen would, when we think Westerners getting into tribal lands, and they're going to oppress everybody. But for example, I work with the niece, the granddaughter rather of this gentleman. The son of this gentleman was a board member of our tourism board. He was a lawyer educated in London and so on. So they went very rapidly from headhunters, because he was a big headhunter, a smaller headhunter, but still a headhunter. They went in the same generation, and they went from headhunters to politicians and so on. This gentleman, Tun Juga, he became a minister in the Malaysian state, because he was instrumental in let's say, making the people of Sarawak accept the idea of Malaysia later on, many years after that. And he was not an educated person in the British sense. He hadn't gone to school, he probably couldn't read and write very well. And the story says that the first time that he went on a helicopter, because when you enter into a home in these parts of the world, you take off your shoes. So when he went into the helicopter, he left his shoes outside of the helicopter, because he was being polite. They said, what happened? So yeah, so it's a very interesting, the story of Sarawak reads like a novel, and in fact, Lord Jim of Somerset Maugham or William Kipling, they got their inspiration on this character, on the Brooke family. And on the other side of Borneo, on the eastern side of the Sultanate of Brunei, the lands then also got a very different colonial story, because in North Borneo it was first some commercial interests that were interested in that part. There was even an Austrian businessman for a short while, then a USA businessman, and eventually the whole area became known as the North Borneo, the British North Borneo, because a chartered company basically bought the part of North Borneo from the sultans, and also bought it from the sultans of the Philippines, of the Sulu and so on, who claim that area, which is, up to this day, there are people in the Philippines who claim the state of what has become Sabah. So two different colonial experiences, a private company exploiting the land for resources, and a family-run kingdom that was quite advanced for the time, because from James Brooke onwards, they encouraged their civil servants to interact with the people, not to travel with big retinues on sedan chairs, but to go on the long boats with the people, to discuss sitting on the floor, eating the same thing, drinking with the chieftains under the watchful eye of all the heads that have been connected by the people. They encouraged to have what was called a sleeping dictionary, so they could learn the language easier if they were with a young lady from the houses, and there were many of these relationships. So it was a different type of colonialism, but it won't last forever, of course, because the modern era, the modern world, will arrive into these territories, and the British were more and more interested with this. First, there was a question of Brunei. Brunei was losing land left and right, and there was the fear that Brunei would be overtaken by the white Rajas, as they were known, by the Rajas of Sarawak. And of course, the sultans of Brunei, they were worried about this, so they started writing to the Ottoman Sultan, to the Germans, to the French. So the British were worried that there could be another influence in the region. And in White Holland, there in the British corridors of power, there was one faction that was in favor that the whole of Brunei be absorbed into Sarawak under the Brooks, and there was another faction who was in favor of keeping the independence of Brunei, keeping the Sultan in place, and not allow the Brooks to take it all over. Eventually, that was the faction that won the day, and they kind of proposed with not much option of saying no to the Sultan to have a British protectorate, meaning that and not only protectorate, but a protectorate with a resident, and the British resident, who built himself a nice house, was basically going to advise the Sultan on all affairs, especially external affairs, and with the Sultan retaining decisions when it came to religion, when it came to custom and so on, and the finances of the Sultanate were going to be administered by the British. So that's why in 1888 Brunei became a British protectorate, and so they didn't lose any more territory to the Brooks. At that time, it was a rather poor country. There was nothing much to make money from. There was a type of tree bark, I think, called the Kutch, that was the main industry. Some fishing, some sago planting, some things like that. The Sultan could barely buy himself a shirt, lived in a dilapidated palace, so the condition was not very good, and the British were administering this place, this small place that had remained as a territory under the Sultans of Brunei. But eventually, a few years down the line, they will get lucky. Why? Because that part of West Brunei that they didn't want to trade for the district of Liban was the part where in the 1920s, a Dutch company that had previously dealing in the trade of seashells and things like that, they had started finding oil in Sarawak, and then in 1929 they struck oil in the place called Seri, and that changed the fate of Brunei forever. So the Shell company, that's basically when they started in Borneo, and they will also play the petrol and the oil and the gas later on, will play an important role, of course, in ushering Brunei into the modern world. Because after the initial strike in 1929, they started finding more and more oil onshore and then offshore and gas and so on. So it became really important. It transformed Brunei from the political, from the economic, and also from the cultural aspects. It even led to constitutional changes later in the story, because at some point in 1959 they will end the British resident system although they were still under the British for external affairs and defense, but they had then self-rule under the previous Sultanate, number 28, before the current Sultanate, who was good at negotiating. But before that, in the 1941, late 1941, early 1942, Brunei will be also one of the countries that will fall under the Japanese occupation, because basically they wanted the oil of Brunei. It would be a brutal, usually brutal occupation, mostly for the Chinese population, the European population. They managed to basically coerce the Sultan to agree to whatever they were saying. And eventually Brunei will be liberated with the rest of Borneo by mostly Australian troops, with American troops. And after the liberation of Borneo, the Raja of Sarawak and the administrators of the North Borneo Company, they didn't have the means to rebuild after the devastation of the war. So Rainer Brooke abdicated and gave Sarawak to the British as a British Crown colony, and so did the North Borneo Company. They gave it as a British Crown colony. So that was the end of the Brooke Raja. They are pretenders to the throne, and his nephew, nephew didn't want this session. He wanted to continue the lineage, but of course they're still involved, and they still become, they visit, they have Facebook page and so on for the descendants. I think the latest one is called Jason Brooke, and he still comes from time to time in Sarawak. So once Sarawak and Sabah were British Crown colonies, the years passed, and in 1957, Malaya, which is the peninsula between Thailand and Singapore, they had first formed a federation of Malaya after the war, and eventually in 1957 they became independent. At that time there was the danger of communism, there was the danger of Indonesian expansionism, because they also had declared unilaterally independent. So the British came with a plan that some quarters dubbed the neo-colonial plan, which was to put together West Malaysia or Malaya with Sabah and Sarawak, with Singapore, and with the with the Sultanate of Brunei, to form the Federation of Malaysia. So Sabah and Sarawak and Singapore at the time, they decided to join the Federation of Malaysia, but the Sultan of Brunei decided not to join Malaysia because of a number of reasons. First of all, there had been some troubles in 1962 that made it riots and people arrested and so on, and people said to that they saw there was an attempt by the Indonesians to interfere in those negotiations. The Indonesians called it a neo-colonial plot, so they were worried that the Indonesians were actually going to take the whole of North Borneo. So they rather prefer to stay under the umbrella of the British. Furthermore, the Sultan in Brunei is an absolute monarch, so he doesn't have to answer to anybody. Within a Federation of Malaysia, he will be one of the other sultans, and the Federation of Malaysia had the system that every 5 years, one of the sultans becomes the king of Malaysia for 5 years, but they are constitutional kings. They don't make all the political decisions. So he was not so much in favor of that. And furthermore, the oil was starting really to flow and to be good, big money, and they didn't want to share this with the rest of Malaysia, because that was part of the agreement. They were a small population with lots of oil, so why not keep it to themselves? So he decided to stay out of the Federation of Malaysia, and a few years after, the Sultan at the time, Sir Omar Ali Saifuddin, he will decide to abdicate in favor of his young son, who became the new Sultan of Brunei. He will remain as a kind of senior Minister of Defense after that, until 1984, when once they were not fearing so much being annexed by Malaysia, especially by Indonesia, not fearing the communists, and so on, then they decided that they were ready to take their independence. And they were not really fighting for independence, they were telling the British, wait, we will take it when the time comes, and the time came in 1984. Brunei became an independent nation, and that was important for Brunei, because it meant that they had full control over the revenue from the oil and gas. They were already raking in the dollars, and especially the royal family was getting a lot of royalties from this. So Brunei today is a country called Mega Brunei Darussalam, which means the country of Brunei, the abode of peace. It's a small country, 5,765 square kilometers, that's about 2,226 square miles, or about twice the size of Luxembourg in Europe, or about the size of the state of Delaware, if you can picture Delaware in the USA. The population is about 460, around 470,000 people. Majority of them, about 3/4, are Malays, not the native population there. There is about 10% of Chinese and about 16% of a mix of nationalities, including the foreigners working there. But unlike places like Dubai or Qatar, or these places, the local population is still the majority. There are a number of foreign workers, but they don't make the majority of the population like in those oil-rich countries. The capital is called Bandar Seri Begawan, or BSB for short, and it used to be known as Brunei Town, but then in honor of the past Sultan, after he passed away, it was renamed Bandar Seri Begawan, because Seri Begawan was the title of the previous Sultan. It's a rather urbanized country, and not many people work in agriculture, so about 78% of the population lives in the towns. The main town is, of course, Bandar Seri Begawan, that has maybe some 200,000 people living there. It's a bit fluid who lives in Bandar, who lives in the surrounding areas. All the borders, all the land borders of Brunei are with the Malaysian state of Sarawak. So they're surrounded on all sides by Sarawak, and then by the South China Sea in front of them. And they have a coastline of about 161 kilometers, 100 miles, and the highest peak is called Bukit Pagon. Bukit Pagon is 1,850 meters high, 6,070 feet, and it's located in the exclave called Temburong, that the eastern side of Brunei that is very lightly populated. In terms of government, it's a unitary Islamic absolute monarchy. It's led by a hereditary sultan, 29th of his lineage, and it's only one of the 7 last absolute monarchies in the world. And it's always good to know for quizzes, because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. Kuwait, Qatar, the older Sultanate, which is Oman, the tiny African country of Eswatini, and some people find it strange, but the Vatican also is considered to be an absolute monarchy, because although it's not hereditary, he doesn't need to answer to anybody if he has some decrees. And together with Oman, Brunei and Oman are the only 2 sovereign countries that go by the name of sultanates. And there are other sultans, but they are part of Malaysia, of Indonesia, of the Philippines, of Pakistan, of some African countries. But as sovereign countries with the title of sultan is Oman. Oman has the desert and the camels. Brunei has the jungle and the monkeys and things like that. So, not to be confused. It's a relatively rich country for its size. It has about $44 billion in GDP, purchase power parity. That places them 137 in the world. But per capita, because there are not many of them, they have about $96,000 in purchase power parity, and that puts them in 7th place in the world. So in the ASEAN region, after Singapore, then you have Brunei. The economy, of course, is mostly dominated by oil and gas. 80% or so of their exports are oil and gas. Otherwise, they have quite a lot of investment revenue. They have a sovereign fund with lots of properties and assets around the world. They have some services, tourism, they are trying to develop, so it's not yet overtaken by tourism. It's one of those places where you don't have yet the problems of over-tourism, and then there is some attempts at agriculture. There are some people who grow things, but it's not a big business in the country. The currency is called the Brunei dollar, and one Brunei dollar is the same as one Singapore dollar. They have a parity exchange, so if you have some Singapore dollars left from yesterday, good news, you can use them in Brunei. They're accepted now. So the rate of exchange is the same with the Singapore dollar. So one euro, 151 Brunei dollars, one US dollar, 130 Brunei dollars, and one British pound, about 173 Brunei dollars. Majority of the population, about 81%, are practice Sunni Islam, and the Sunni branch of Islam. There are some 10-11% of Christians, most of whom are either local Chinese or expatriates, mostly Filipinos and others. Then the Chinese population, some of them are still Buddhist, Taoist, and they mix the two. There are one temple in the capital to do practice their religion. Some of the indigenous people, who are not Malays, but who are from the Borneo tribes, some of them, they still have their own beliefs, and there are probably a few Sikhs and so on who live there. There is no restriction on practice, so if you're a Sikh or if you're a Christian, you can practice, there is a church to go and so on, but it is forbidden to proselytize or to try to convert a Muslim to another religion. You can be a messenger for them. If you start going on about Jesus to a local Muslim, that is a no-no. Even bringing Bible, especially Bible written in the Malay language, that is completely forbidden. And sometimes they stop at the border missionaries, people who want to evangelize everybody on the planet. They sometimes try to sneak into Brunei, but if they are identified, they are stopped, they are expelled from the country. So they take this seriously. The official language is Malay, so if you speak Malay, no problem, you can talk to everybody, but luckily most people do speak English, it's kind of semi-official language. And the Malay, you will see it's written in two alphabets. One is called the Rumi alphabet, meaning the Latin alphabet, so you can read what's there. And others, it looks like Arabic, but it's not really Arabic. It's called Jawi script, which is the same way that they write Malay with the Roman characters, they write Malay with the Arabic characters. So it's not Arabic, it's Malay written with the Arabic script. Those two are used from an official point of view. And of course, when it comes to religious texts and so on, they are written in proper Arabic. So English is the language of business. People switch from one to another, mix the two often in meetings, for example. There will be part English, part Malay that is spoken in the meetings. The Chinese, they speak usually dialects like Hokkien or Hakka or Cantonese, and then there are a few indigenous languages that are still spoken in the country. A country then that owns its wealth, its good life to the oil and gas, which has brought billions of dollars to the country, and it's really the state that depends almost entirely on oil and gas. For example, in the 1980s, they celebrated with this monument the first billion barrel of oil that had been extracted from the Seri oil field. They have nowadays, most of it is offshore, so they have quite an extensive and very modern and very advanced offshore gas, especially gas operation. They export mostly with trains of ships exporting, big ships exporting natural liquefied gas, which they can liquefy today, and petrol. So the main clients are South Korea and Japan. They do export also a bit around the world, and this is an image that basically is Brunei in one photo. A very pious Muslim country with a lot of money coming from the oil. So oil and religion, they do mix quite well in Brunei. And because the Sultan and his family, and the Sultan is the absolute monarch, absolute ruler of Brunei, they get a big chunk that is not very much monitored by outside the people of the oil money. So they do get very rich. There is a Brunei investment agency. It's like a sovereign fund, but it's not as transparent as let's say registered or surveillance. For example, the Norwegian sovereign fund, which is of public matter. So it's more of a private matter, but it means that they have lots of money, which they share, and they don't accumulate everything and let people starve. So it's a very good deal for them. But this has brought the attention of many people because of some of the excesses for which Brunei is known. For example, the Sultan of Brunei has the largest car collection in the world, rumored to be between 5,000 and 7,000 cars, rumored to cost about $5 billion. But some of them are also these families, so it was exactly the number. But he's got a big garage. And he, in the 80s and 90s, when it was the time of a bigger boom and when they were spending without really keeping so much an eye on the spending, they kept Rolls-Royce afloat because they were buying basically half of the production of Rolls-Royce and at the time also he had his second wife who liked Rolls-Royce, and there were quite a few. One time I went there, that second wife, on top of her kids, she liked adopting kids. She had also lots of cats and a house for the cats, but she took kids from Bosnia, from Sierra Leone, and so on. And two twins from Sierra Leone, they were in the same class as my younger kid, and so they were friends, and they came to my house, and they went to the palace. And one time I drove my son to the birthday of the kids at the palace, and as I was driving by, I saw the entrance to the garage, a cavernous garage under the palace, where you had Rolls-Royces bumper to bumper, all the way even outside of the garage. So you had the pink Rolls-Royce, the blue Rolls-Royce, the green Rolls-Royce. I suppose depending on the mood of the day, they would use a different Rolls-Royce to go on. Now they had cars made for the children when the kids were small, so they would decorate the car with a Pikachu or a Pumbaa or something like that. For the 18th birthday of one of the daughters of the Sultan, normally if you give a car to somebody for the 18th birthday, that's nice, but he gave his daughter a 737 Boeing plane, in gold and so on, painted with the colors. Well, thank you, Daddy, for that beautiful plane that you can fly around the world. The Sultan himself has a number of planes because he's also a pilot, so he's known for example, I remember when there was the APEC in Peru, I watched the news and they were showing him arriving, landing the plane in the Lima airport and commenting on this world leader who was arriving to an international meeting, flying his 747 himself. There is a lot of gold on the plane, so I don't know how they take off, but there is from the toilets to the it's all decorated with gold. They do like gold because yellow is the royal color. So for example, if you go to a royal reception, you shouldn't wear yellow. On the street is okay, but if you go and greet the king and the sultan, don't wear yellow. They have also a polo club because many of them are polo players. The sultan himself, especially his youth, he was quite a good polo player, and he played with Prince Charles and these kind of people, and won some matches, and he was of quite a good level. But of course, what helped is that he had something like 2,000 Argentinian horses in air conditioning stables with Argentinian teachers and people who took care of the horses. So probably that helped in his game. And the Sultan of Brunei, of course, there were 4 brothers and 1 sister. So one of the brothers, the one just after the Sultan, Prince Mohammed, he was the more serious, the more religious one. Then you had Prince Sufri, who had a skin condition, but still managed to marry a beautiful lady, and he was a bit less out of the public view. And then you had the sister, who was a very nice lady, very outgoing, and she was the ambassador to the United Nations for Brunei. And the younger brother, Prince Jeffrey, he is the one who brought a bit of trouble to the country, if you follow the story, because he was put in charge of the Brunei Investment Agency and of the Ministry of Finance. So it's like, putting a kid in charge of the candy shop, basically. So he did make some investments. Some were not so good because, for example, he bought, Asprey, that company that makes silverware and very highly luxurious things. And he bought this company that they realized that the main client that bought more than half of the production of Asprey was Brunei itself, because they all have. So he made some bad investment decisions. He bought a lot of things for himself, cars and planes, big palaces and so on. And the bevy of Filipino starlets were coming all the time, and then also some models from the USA that also came to entertain The royals apparently said, oh, we thought that we were coming to do modeling. Of course, they were asked to do a bit more than modeling when they were in the country, and they were surprised because of that. So he had a lot of palace and so on. And during those days, when the children of the Sultan were still young, one time he wanted to go and visit Disneyland, like many parents do, but he wanted Disneyland to close the Disneyland so he and his kids could visit quietly without having to deal with the people. So Disneyland refused, and he was of course upset by this, so he built a $1 billion amusement park in Brunei, so the Begawan Park, full of rides and very, very nice, and that was free and for the people. Of course, they closed whenever the royal family came, but otherwise it was open to the public. They didn't have to pay. People came from Malaysia and so on to play in the swings. There was a big, roller coaster and so on. So those were the boom days in the 80s, in the 90s, early 90s of Brunei, when the Sultan celebrated his 50th birthday. He brought in Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Michael Bolton. They came and they played for the family. Then they played free concerts in the Begawan Park for the people. So people came from all over. Michael Jackson was told not to grab his crotch when he was doing his show, because of course that's not compatible. But he was paid a few $1 million, so he could, resist the itch of grabbing his crotch. And Prince Charles came for the birthday, and a lot of royal family there. Because at that time, Brunei was spending a lot of money buying airplanes, buying tanks, buying helicopters, buying frigates, and so on, buying lots of things, helping Rolls-Royce survive and so on. 10 years later, for the 60th birthday, we got some Duke of Kent or somebody who's never heard about, who came to represent the royal house. And they were not buying as much as 10 years before, so many of the royals were kind of second degree royals, and they have some unknown rappers coming and so on. So things have changed, because in this boom of the 80s and the 90s, there was free spending. There were people coming from all over the world with something to try to sell to the royals. They would park themselves for months at the Sheraton Hotel to try to get a meeting with the Sultan or with the brother or with one of the decision makers to sell anything. If you sold air conditioning to the whole family, that was like thousands of air conditioners at an inflated price. I remember there was one guy who managed to sell street lamps, about $10,000, $20,000 per street lamp. Very beautiful street lamps, but they had bought a lot of them. They put them in streets where they still have to build the houses in the streets, so they were just sitting there. But they were beautiful, and whoever sold those street lamps back himself a fortune, as it was worth the months of patience. The brother of the Sultan, Prince Jeffrey, then he presided over all this from the Ministry of Finance, beautiful tall building, very intelligent building for the time, that had a lift so he could drive. Usually he went in like Ferraris and Lamborghinis, drive straight into the lift, and then be lifted up to his office to the top without having to go down from his Lamborghini until he reached the top. Unfortunately, a bit of mismanagement, maybe a bit of excessive personal consumption and so on, he blew about 20 billion of the family fortune. So that's a big chunk, especially since Brunei tried to shore some of the Asian currencies during the Asia crisis. So they bet, they tried to pull up the rupiah, the Indonesian rupiah, the Malaysian ringgit, and they lost a lot of money. So suddenly the fortune became a bit less. They became a lot more cautious after that on how to spend the money, how there was less conspicuous spending in so they bought a little less cars, still bought later Rolls-Royce for the Crown Prince wedding, and the old Formula One car or McLaren and things like that, but not as much as before. Because for example, he had like 700 Ferraris and so on, so different colors and so on. And Prince Jeffrey bought a lot of cars, and then years after they were sold at auction. So people like to go to these auctions, even if you didn't buy the car. So an 8-liter Mercedes Benz with 221 miles on the dashboard was sold for a small price. So if you could afford them, you had to, of course, repair, because those were cars that had been idle for years, and that had very little mileage on them. So that was something that people paid more attention than they pay from the rulers of the Gulf countries in the Arabian Gulf, because those countries are more useful to big countries like the US. To put it frankly, Brunei is easier to take pot shots at Brunei for the kind of spending that is normal in the Arabian Gulf. And Brunei, as I said, the Sultan and his family, they don't keep it all to themselves and the heck with the local people. And Brunei is known as a shell-fare state, because of course the main oil company there is Shell. It's very important for the country, and all this money means that there are no taxes in Brunei, no income taxes, education is free, medicine is free, medical care, at least now for the locals, before also for foreigners, but now for the locals. They have built museums and infrastructure. So a lot of the Shell money also goes into the public, and the Sultan, the government builds housing all the time, and new housing, and this type of new housing blocks that people can buy for relatively little money. It's heavily subsidized, and they can expand the house as they get richer. And he usually goes there to give the keys and so on in ceremonies where people are very grateful that His Majesty is visiting, and they invite him to take cakes and tea with them in the house. And the people who work for Shell and the few other companies like Total and so on, who are also oil interest in Brunei, they love working in Brunei, because many of them, they used to work in countries where you have to have like barriers before you go into the compound. You need to have security all the time. You have to be careful where you go and so on. When you go to the oil compounds and the oil areas of Shell and so on, it is something that the sultans have insisted on. There should be no barriers around the houses. So they all have gardens, open gardens next to the neighbor door. You go there, you see little Dutch kids with a helmet going on bicycle around. You have monkeys who are walking around. You have hornbills. You have little houses for the hornbills. So they live very, very nice, very peaceful and safe lives. And of course, petrol is heavily subsidized. You can buy it also for the boats, or the river, the water. And then 1 liter of petrol is cheaper than 1 liter of water. So if you buy a bottle of water, it will cost you more than if you put petrol in your car. And people, unlike Singapore, where it's an ultra luxury to buy cars, Brunei has the first or the second highest car ownership in the world. Everybody has cars. My neighbor, they have something like 5, 6, 7 cars. I could never count them all because they didn't know who was there. Even myself, I had 2 cars, 1 motorbike, and that was not too much. Many of the people, the colleagues I work with, they have 2, 3 cars per family. So you have 1 car to go, let's say, to Malaysia, 1 car to go to a function, 1 car to go shopping, 1 car to take the kids to school, and so on. And that explains why there are not so many taxis, not so many buses. Because if you take one of the rare buses in Brunei, you will see that 90% of the people in the bus are foreigners from Bangladesh, from Indonesia, from the Philippines, but very few Bruneians take the bus. Taxis, very little need for taxis, because I don't know, maybe in the last few years, tourism has increased to the point that some people have decided that it was cooler to be a taxi driver than a civil servant, but otherwise it's a bit difficult. There is an application called DART that works a bit like Grab or Uber. You might find taxis this way. And Brunei also has invested a lot of money abroad. They have many properties, prestigious properties, like the Bel Air Hotel, the Beverly Hills Hotel. In London, they have the Dorchester Hotel, like the Dorchester collection owned by the Brunei Investment Agency. They have hotels in Paris, in Milan, in Rome, in many other places. So that's just the most visible aspects of the investments in made by the Brunei Investment Agency. And Brunei is under a philosophy that they call the MIB philosophy, which means Melayu Islam Raja, or the Malay Islamic monarchy. It's the guiding philosophy that basically means that it's a monarchy. First of all, it's a Malay monarchy, so it has some cultural characteristics of a Malay monarchy, and it's an Islamic country, so Islam is the state religion, is the religion of the majority of the population, and it's a religion that they think helps them in the sense that there is no earthquake in Brunei. It's below the typhoon belt. There are very few flooding. They have more than they can do with oil and gas. They are rich and they live very well. There is practically no crime in Brunei. So they think that all this is due to their Islamic faith. So that's why they're very particular in maintaining, but not, let's say, not in an extreme way. For example, when on the highway with the mosque at the background, you see the written Allah Akbar, it doesn't mean that it's not a political statement. It's a religious statement. So you have, I think, more mosques per capita than any country in the world. The children go to religious education from an early age, and the Quran and so on, which gives a good excuse for people in the public service to take off from the office and go take the kids to the religious school, back from the religious school, then the prayers and so on. Ramadan is observed. The weekend, to make everybody happy, is Friday and Sunday. So like if Muslims are happy on Friday, then the Christians and the expatriates are happy on Sunday. And there are talks apparently to extend the weekend also to Saturday. So like this, even more people happy. The weekend will be from Friday to Saturday. During the months of Ramadan, only months with the Muslims, the office work is only from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. So at 3 p.m. there is no lunch break. Work stops and everybody goes to the Ramadan markets to buy delicious things there to take home and so on. And then the Sultan invites people for evening prayers. So you have groups of people from all walks of life that are invited to go and pray together with the Sultan in the palace. So they take their religions seriously. And a few years ago, and because before that, the law was always a mix of British common law and religious law. So when I was living there, for example, if a Muslim couple was caught having, illicit no outside of marriage relations, they could be fined or in theory jailed, but it happened very little, or stoned under Sharia. But not in Brunei, but in Malaysia, where some party was proposing the idea of stoning adulterers. At the time, the Prime Minister of Malaysia said that there wouldn't be enough stones in Malaysia if they had to stone every adulterer. You can see that there are factions that take the religion with a bit of more rationality. So there were some laws that were applicable only to Muslims for religious offenses, eating during Ramadan, not going to prayers and things like that. But then in the 2014, like this, the Sultan, who is getting in advance of the years and so on, so he wants to educate the population, he wants also to, because he didn't always do very religious things in his youth, he wants to make amends, he wants to go to heaven, so he made the Sharia law the main law of the country. And of course, the Sharia law is the law descended from what was applicable in the 7th century from Prophet Muhammad. So of course there are some very harsh medieval punishments that are included in this law, amputating the hand of thieves. So because after the second time we cannot steal anymore with our hands, or stoning people for sexual offences, homosexuality and so on. So everybody got panic. So when is it going? We have to boycott everything Bruneian and so on. The same people who gladly would go to a football match in a stadium that is owned by the Saudi royal family, who actually does stone people and cut hands. But in Brunei, the idea was to have these laws on paper, because like these people can think more of religion and so on. But for example, to condemn a homosexual couple, they have to be caught in the act by 4 reliable male witnesses. So unless you're doing a show, it's quite difficult to get the conditions that you have 4 reliable male people who can testify that they have seen this couple doing things that are according to the law not supposed to do. And so the burden of proof is extremely high before you can be condemned with Sharia. And even if you're by some chance get in front of 4 reliable males, there has been since the 1950s a moratorium on the death penalty. Because maybe, I don't know if you have to fill up the bars we had, but you see there are deaths for drug traffickers. It's very taken seriously. Years ago, in the 80s, when I visited for the first time Brunei, as we arrived into Brunei, in the water village, a big billboard with a rope hanging from the billboard and saying death to the. But nobody has been executed in Brunei since 1957. Even drug traffickers were being condemned to death. So they don't really apply those things. Nobody has lost their hand for stealing, and very few people do steal actually in Brunei. And the adulterers, they know better than to do it in front of 4 reliable main witnesses. Same with the homosexuals. I mean, remember, you know, when sometimes when the ships arrive, we have these folk shows and folklore shows. We welcome the ship, and we don't have them. Still again tomorrow, we used to have them, and we used to hire a troupe of folk dancers who do that when the ships arrive. And the leader of this troupe was Fifi, and Fifi was obviously transitioning from male to female, and he would often come to our meetings in our office, which was more liberal-minded with women's clothes, and then if we had to meet with the minister and so on, he would come uncomfortably in men's clothes to do everything. But everybody knew that Fifi was not going to get married anytime soon. And also some people were obviously notoriously not going to get married. And as long as they didn't do it in front of 4 reliable male witnesses, it was not much of a problem. But then that created some confusion internationally. People, of course, stars of Hollywood, they wanted to boycott the hotels of the Sultan because they thought that the day after the promulgation of these laws, that they were going to round up the gays and stone them to death. That, of course, never happened. So Brunei, of course, is a country that still relies overwhelmingly with the oil and gas. For years, and the first time I noticed Brunei, in 30 years, oil and gas will run out. When I started working with Brunei about 23 years ago, they were saying, oh, the oil and gas will run out in 30 years, and so that there was an urgency then to develop tourism. Nowadays, they're still saying the oil and gas will run out in 30 years. So it seems to be always, because they always keep finding new fields, lots of gas, lots of oil, and so on. So apparently they still have some time before the oil and gas runs out. But if it eventually does, first they have spent wisely some of the money. They have built the longest bridge in Southeast Asia. Now you can go straight from the main part of Brunei to the small part of Brunei without having to go through Malaysia. Because before the bridge, if you wanted to go to the districts of Temburong, you had to go through the Malaysian district, which skewed our tourism statistics, which I always tell them, use the airplane statistics, because, for example, if you're a Dutch person living in Mili, on the western side of Brunei, in Sarawak, if you're going to the East Malaysian side of Sabah, to and fro, that would mean about 8 times crossing the border. So that showed us 8 Dutch people coming into Brunei, where it was the same person going through and fro. So nowadays, of course, it's easier to avoid that. But of course, they will face one day this problem. They do build some nice things, but they don't build the same as, for example, Dubai and so on. I'm pretty sure that tomorrow I'm going to recognize much of the Brunei that I left 13 years ago, because they don't have this building frenzy. And anyway, in the downtown area, you cannot build taller than the minaret of the mosque. So they are basically limited by this. When some developer tried to do that, they had him demolish the top floor, because that was enormous. But there is always this fear of what happens after the oil runs out, because the economy needs to be diversified, because the oil and gas side does bring most of the revenue, but not most of the workforce. You don't need that many people to work in the oil industry, and the rest of the people then they tend to work for the government, work sometimes in brackets, but you cannot sustain a whole country with a civil service that is because it's modernizing, because they want to become more AI dependent, and so on. So at some point, the people are going to need to do something different. And that was the idea of developing tourism and other industries and so on. And now they have the Chinese that try to help them. So we will see what the future brings. But the future in big part depends on what happens to the monarchy. At the moment, the monarchy is of course very stable. There is no, let's say, possibility of it going away anytime soon. And the current Sultan is the 29th Sultan of his line, as I say, the second longest reigning dynasty. And the Sultan, well, the whole name and style and titles and so on is Kebawaduliya Mahamulia. And we can see that in the Sultan Haji Hassan al-Bolkiah, who is in Wadahullah Ibn al-Makum, Sultan Haji Omar Ali Saifuddin Saidul Ali Wadien, Sultan Danyan di Bertuan Milahabunai Darussalam. But his friends called him Boppa. But usually you say Sultan Bolkiah, Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah, that's the short version. But when they read the news, or when they publish in the newspaper, they have to put the whole title. So half of the news, because he does go over schools and so on, is just reading the title, and so on and so on. And he's the head of state, of course, but he's also the prime minister, the minister of defense, the minister of finance, the minister of economy, and apparently now he's also minister of foreign affairs. And before his brother was minister of foreign affairs, and so apparently he's taken this ministry with him, as he's the head of the police, of the army, of the Boy Scouts, of the university, the chancellor of the university. So he is a busy person. He doesn't just rest on his laurels. He's a very popular sultan, of course. He lives in a modest palace called the Istana Nurul Imam, the largest in the world, with 1,788 rooms. So probably now mobile phones help if he wants to track his kids or his wife. Before it was a bit difficult. But the palace is beautiful. It was built by a Filipino construction company, Filipino architect. It's modern. It's of course lots of gold. They do love gold, and it is not completely closed. Of course, it's not something that can be visited, although we used to ask that a lot. But once a year, during the festival at the end of Ramadan, the tradition in this part of the world is to hold what's called open house. And so at the end, you have like 15 days where you do nothing but go into open houses. You go with the minister, you go with your boss, you go and so on. But the Sultan also holds open house, only that instead of having 200, 300 people visiting, there is something like 300,000 people visiting the palace every end of Ramadan. So that means almost the entire population of Brunei goes there. So the males go and visit the male side of the family, the females go and visit the female side of the family. There is a long line, you get food. As you enter, you go then after in line, and then you go and you go on the male line and the female line, and you go and greet the Sultan, and most of the members of the family shake hands with the Sultan. And luckily for the Sultan, in Brunei, it is not traditional. It's not like a Donald Trump pumping the hands of the people he meets, and there is just a light touch, and so he can take 100 and something thousand people greeting him over 3 days. And so there is this line, and you have the Sultan, the Crown Prince, the brothers in order of age, then the brothers of the Crown Prince, and so on, lining up, shaking hands, thank you. And as you come out, you get a little box, yellow box, with a card from the Sultan to wish you a happy Hari Raya, with some cakes and chocolates and a drink and so on. And the little kids, and they get a green packet with $5 inside. So of course they're very happy, and that's why people come with whole cousins and so on. And so you see fans arriving and a whole bunch of kids they're coming down and to get those $5. Crispy new banknotes with this. And the females go on the other side. So normally males cannot go, but one time there was this BBC reporter, a female reporter. Came mostly for the nature, but it was during the time of Ramadan, so we got to go with the whole TV crew in the female area. So I managed to see what was going on, and that was the year when the Sultan had married his second wife, because he married in the 60s his first cousin, still married today. Then at some point he married an air stewardess who had also Japanese and Scottish heritage, and they had 4 kids together, and they divorced. And a few years after divorcing, he married a TV newscaster from Malaysia, but caught his eye when she was interviewing him. But nobody liked her because they saw her as a gold digger. She was 33 years younger than the Sultan, and apparently so there was a lot more ladies on that year because they all wanted to see that new queen and gossip about her. So that was the idea. So we managed to see, and the gossip was right because I think 1 or 2 years later she was caught sending boxes of instant noodles filled up with crispy banknotes from the bank. So they divorced as well. Also, at the moment he's only with his one wife from the 1960s. He's also very popular. He walks about. He goes around town. He has very little protection. He drives himself usually. I don't know now. He's getting. He's going to be 80, I think, next year. I don't know if he does all this, but you often see him driving around town. And there was one famous video that went viral one day when because he drives his own car, but he's got an escort, so he doesn't have to bother about green lights or traffic lights or things like that. But one of his motorbike escorts fell down, and as he was down on the floor, assisted by the other escorts, the Sultan was out of his car directing the traffic, so they wouldn't. So people were surprised to see the Sultan really pleased. So they could tend to do injury. So he was good in that sense. And for example, when there were floods and things like that, he would go and he would get into the. I mean, he would afford even if there were luxury shoes. He probably had a few other pairs waiting, so he would go into the floods, even if to the waist and so. Where some ministers they were like, no, you want to go into the flood. They wanted the, so that's why he was very popular and still is very popular with the people. The succession is ensured now because he has his first son with he has older sisters, but it's a male line of succession with his first wife, who's his first cousin, also by the same way. And he married a half Swiss, half Bruneian lady, Princess Sarah, which is very beautiful, and they married a nice little ceremony with a gold plated Rolls Royce and things like that. So they have children nowadays, and now, since Prince Charles became king, he is the longest waiting crown prince in the world. He's been crown prince since 1975, I think, or something like that. So, and they are older children. They are all the brothers, and the sister, and the nephews, and so on. And, but among the 13, I think now it's 13 kids, the 4 that were born with the second wife, the one with the Scottish and Japanese ancestry, are the most popular ones, the more followed on Facebook. And you have now they are married, but you have Princess Azima, who's very beautiful, and she's a polo player also. They all play sports. They all play in the Southeast Asia games and so on. At least when they're young. And then there was Prince Hatim, still, who is young, and who was named as the most eligible bachelor in Asia, and eventually he married a school sweetheart, and they were both at the same school where my son was going. He was 2 years a senior, and she was probably to say, if not class, the same year as my son. So I had to ask him, she knows her, because we married recently, and he has 3 million followers on Instagram or something like that, because he's also, he was take pictures of him with his six-pack and very sporty and so on. So he's very popular. The Crown Prince, the Crown Prince is the Crown Prince. And of course, there are many interesting things to see in Brunei. It's a good place if you want a place that is quiet, culture, with tradition, with good food, with lots of pristine nature and so on. If you want to party all night long, that's not the place to go. That's not because things close quite early. You cannot drink in public. Alcohol, sales of alcohol are forbidden. Sales of cigarettes even are forbidden. So if you want to make a pack of cigarettes, you cannot do it tomorrow. And if you want to smoke, you have to do it in private in your room or something like that. So of course you have to be careful not to have like guns, death penalty or so for carrying guns and even ammunition, even a spent bullet as a necklace that can give you bring you to travel. People have been arrested at the airport for having a spent bullet, and that can carry as well as even the death penalty for that. So they take it very seriously. That's why it's a very safe country. In the 9 years I was living there were 4 murders, and they were with knives, and there were murders of passion. So they were family troubles. But otherwise you feel very safe. People used to leave their car running when they were going to shop, so the car was cool when they came back, and so on. Some of the things to visit, you have all the things related to royalty, and mostly a museum called the Royal Regal Museum. You have all the things related to the official part of the monarchy. It used to be a museum dedicated to Winston Churchill, because the father, he liked Winston Churchill, and then after he passed away, the statue of Winston Churchill with cigar in the hand and so on was taken and it's somewhere where it's not visible anymore. It has become royal regalia, right in the center of town. You have also the mosque of the father, the Sultan Mosque, a beautiful example with gold tiled dome on the top and beautiful interiors. If you go into a mosque, you have of course to remove your shoes, you have to wear robes if you have shorts, or if you have bare shoulders and so on. Then they will ask you to put on a robe if you go in. And the Sultan, of course, he built his own mosque, which is one of the most beautiful mosques in Southeast Asia, very impressive, very grand. It has 29 minarets because the 29 cupolas, rather domes, because he's the 29th Sultan and so on. I made an escalator for the handicapped people and for the royalty to go up. So it's a beautiful mosque. It's also often included in the tours of the capital, and that's really one. An attraction also that is very popular is the water village. It used to be very much bigger, and now they have built also modern versions of the water village, so you can so there should be less exotic, but there's still quite a few houses and these boats that go at high speed in the water. And most of the people, they have cars, so there are big parking lots outside. So they park the car in the big parking lots, and they take a boat to go home. The water taxis are called, they're usually taxis. You have a lot of the water taxis. You can take them from the downtown area, and they can take you not only to water village but also to the interiors to see the nature, the monkeys and so on. And if you go on the tour and so on, often they will take you inside the house of the water village. You will see that they're usually quite big, some of them are quite luxurious, they have big screen TVs and so on, computers and all the things needed for the modern life. And a few minutes away from downtown, and you will get into areas where you have mangroves, you pass behind the palace, you have some houses there, but there is a big buffer zone of mangroves where, if you like, you can see the proboscis monkey, a monkey that is endemic to the island of Borneo. It's a species that has no real other relatives, and the stub-nosed one in Sumatra, but otherwise they're on their own, and they have a big belly, not because they drink beer, but because they have like a 3-pound stomach. They have to digest the tough meat that they eat and so on. So they often have this big belly, they belch a lot, and they have this big nose for the males. And the bigger the nose, the more attractive it is to the females, even though they have a permanent erection. So apparently the females, they focus more on the nose than on what is below the belly. So they're quite funny looking animals, and if you're lucky, you might see them from there. If you want more nature, there is the Temburong area, we have national parks, you have a lot of pristine rainforest, you have different places of nature, so it's really a nature destination. And if you come and spend a few days in Brunei, or if you have the time, you should check this hotel called Empire Hotel. At the time it was the 7-star hotel. It cost like $1 billion. Prince Jeffrey wanted to make it a guest house for the guests that he wanted to fly in from Hollywood, from so on. But of course, fortunes changed, and they had to transform it in a hotel that was mostly empty. So that's why they wanted us to help promote this hotel, which is beautiful. It's difficult to describe, and when you see it, it's really beautiful. It has this kind of, I call it pharaonic modern architecture. It has a 70-meter to 110 feet high lobby. It has some beautiful rooms and suites. It has 2 of these 4 camels that cost $500,000. I think 2 are in Saudi Arabia, 2 are in Brunei. It has a beautiful kind of royal presidential suite that at the time it used to cost $27,000 per night, breakfast included. You had a jacuzzi and a swimming pool and a cinema screen and so on that came down at the time. There are more normal rooms are still very luxurious, but not like the suites and those gold, of course, everywhere. There is inlays of gold in the carpets, in the tapestries. It's really a beautiful, beautiful place. And then if you're going downtown, you have basically two downtown areas. You have one area called around the Yayasana, which is the Sultan's foundation, around the town center. So you have the main attractions of the town around there. And there is a more shopping area called Gadong, where you have the mall. I don't know if they have built other malls, but I think it's still the one and only mall in a big mall like this modern mall in Brunei. It's not Singapore, I guess. Actually, you have malls everywhere. So, and then you have the night market of Gadong and so on. So that's more of the shopping modern area. So the 2 centers, you can walk from one to the other with like 2-3 kilometers or maybe more, with very little, because they don't spend a lot in making pavement walkways, because nobody walks, everybody drives, so why do it? But anyway, it's a very interesting little country. It's something that few people know, few people have visited, so it's really worth going and having a look and taking it with an open mind. And there are some people who make it a pleasure to miss Brunei and to not like Brunei because of these stringent laws and so on, but because it's more illegal, you cannot drink after at night or doing things like this. But you just go next door and you can drink and you can do party and sing karaoke to your heart content. Brunei is a different kind of tourist destination. It's a different kind of experience. It's one that is not yet overrun with tourists, so it's a good thing to go there. So hopefully tomorrow you'll have some happy explorations of Negara Brunei, Darussalam, and maybe one day come back and spend more time there. So thank you very much for your attention.